Hello there, you're watching The Press Preview, our first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. Over the next half an hour, we're going to be talking through the headlines with the writer and researcher Maya Goodfellow and the Guido Fawkes reporter Tom Harwood. So welcome back to both of you. So let's take a look then at what's making the front pages. And The Times leads with Jeremy Corbyn's announcement on the Question Time debate tonight that he would remain neutral on a Brexit referendum. That story is also on the front page of The Telegraph. They say the Labour leader would refuse to back his own deal in a vote. The Daily Mail leads with a story about family doctors voting to scrap home GP visits, and it also has a photograph on its front page of Prince Andrew. The Financial Times has a story about ministers risking an NHS tax breach in a bid to head off pre-poll crisis. The Guardian has a story about calls to end the use of violent sex as a murder defence following the Grace Millane murder trial. The Eye leads with the headline Duke of Nothing and shows a photo of Prince Andrew horse riding with the Queen. The Mirror also has this story on its front cover with the headline Sleazy Rider. The Duke features on the front of the Express too, along with a dementia cure getting closer thanks to more funding. That's their main story. And The Sun, meanwhile, leads with the latest happenings on I'm a Celebrity. Don't know if you've got time for I'm a Celebrity during an election campaign, have you?
I'm going to have to binge watch it right at the end.
Good call. Maya Goodfellow and Tom Harwood here with us tonight. A few of the front pages go with reaction to tonight's BBC Question Time debate, which had four of the party leaders being questioned by the audience. A couple of the papers have picked up on one of the lines that came out of that. You picked out The Times, first of all, and this focuses on Jeremy Corbyn saying that in any second referendum, if Labour were to win, he would remain neutral as far as that referendum was concerned.
Yeah, and I think this was the first new thing we learnt out of tonight's debate. There were a lot of old attack lines that were rehashed for all of the politicians, but this was something that we concretely learnt, and that's that Jeremy Corbyn will stubbornly refuse to take a position on the biggest issue of the day, the issue that all the polls show is the #1 issue for voters this election, the reason why this election was called, and Jeremy Corbyn is neutral on it. I think that that is going to be a line that we're going to hear from both the Lib Dems and the Conservative Party in the weeks ahead.
Well, yes, already the opposition, or the opposition to Corbyn, the other parties are talking about a lack of leadership. But what do you make of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of this talk of leadership and what exactly that means. But I think on this issue where there hasn't been a political consensus around what should happen next. We know that people voted to leave the EU, but on what terms is not clear. And because Parliament hasn't been able to coalesce around any kind of deal for a number of different reasons, we are at a stage where there is this kind of deadlock. And so I think saying we will have a second referendum, which is what Labour's position is. Labour would renegotiate a new deal and they would put Remain on the ballot paper. They say that would happen within 6 months. I don't think it's actually that bad of a stance for Corbyn to say, I would, as someone who would have to enact this, because there's so much distrust. We are at a stage where so many promises have been made by politicians across the spectrum. People feel fed up, they're sick of this, they're sick of feeling like they don't know what's going to happen, feeling like there's this kind of deadlock. Him saying, listen, I will enact whatever the people want. And it's interesting, it depends on which newspaper you're looking at in terms of how it's being framed, because in the Daily Mirror,
yeah, we've got this pages 6 and 7, isn't it? Yeah.
There's an inside spread that is reporting on this as well, and it is also saying, you know, agenda neutral is the headline there because Jeremy Corbyn would take a neutral stance. But they also have this line underneath, Jeremy Corbyn will let the people decide on Brexit, and I think that's how the Labour Party will frame it going forward. We are going to let the people decide.
Well, that's right. And he would say, wouldn't he, that it's a very divided nation, and perhaps in letting people decide rather than him dictating it is a way of trying to bring people together?
It's a curious way to bring people together. If anyone's experienced the division that was wrought with the last referendum, the idea that doing that all over again would somehow heal the country, I think, is preposterous. It's quite curious how the Labour Party have been able to get away, really, with presenting this as a moderate idea. In any other country, rerunning a vote before that vote had been implemented would be seen as an extreme idea. But it's only by virtue of the Lib Dems going even more extreme than the extreme that Labour can get away with saying that this is somehow a pragmatic policy. To most people who voted, and certainly most people who voted Leave, this is a really peculiar, extreme, anti-democratic idea.
I think it's not necessarily a rerun. So the last time we had a referendum, we didn't know on what terms we'd be leaving. And now that we would have some kind of concrete terms about what that leaving would look like. And I think one of the problems over the past few years is that people on the Leave and Remain side have been making all kinds of claims about what it was people wanted when they voted. So you have people like Joe Swinson suggesting that Remainers want Article 50 revoked, which isn't true for all Remainers. It may be true for some people who still want to remain. But equally, on the so-called Leave side, you have people claiming that people want no deal, or they want a very particular kind of deal that Boris Johnson has seen through, or other politicians have suggested might be possible. And we don't know. This is the reality. I understand that people are frustrated. I can understand that there was that vote. But I also think it is true to say that we don't know exactly on what terms we should be leaving, because that wasn't in the referendum.
I think we're just overcomplicating this. There was a referendum, a huge discussion over who has the ultimate arbitration over law in this country. The people decided that the laws that are made in this country should be made by people who are elected by the people of this country, should be made by our parliament and the people in this country. And it's not that complicated to follow that through. The problem has been we've had a hung parliament. We haven't had a government that hasn't been able to get the deal through. But now there's a deal that Boris Johnson's proposing. Most Leavers agree with it. It seems like that's the simplest answer. And to run everything again rides against everything that was said in the last referendum. People said this would be the last chance.
If most Leavers agree with it, then you maybe see the Conservatives winning majority and they enact that, right? And so if that isn't what happens, so the Labour Party proposing an alternative way allows people to vote if they want to elect a government to do that. So this idea as well that it's not that difficult, it's incredibly difficult. You know, whether you like it or not, it is difficult to leave the EU. It's difficult on what terms, and that is very complex.
And a quick final word on Jeremy Corbyn coming out with this, because he has been repeatedly asked by journalists, but also by the Tories in particular, saying, what's your stance? Has he now neutralised this issue by going neutral? Do you think he's got an answer now? This is where I stand. Do you think this means that he's not going to keep being asked that question now?
I think this is going to open him up to exactly the same questions as before. This is someone who is vying to lead the country, and yet on the biggest issue of the day, he doesn't have a position. He can't lead people anywhere because he doesn't know what his own mind is.
No, I think that all of our politicians are going to be asked repeatedly similar questions over again, because we're in the middle of a general election campaign. It's right, they're scrutinised. I think the same attack lines will come from other parties, such as the Conservative Party. But I think that actually having this line, saying what his stance is and repeating that isn't necessarily going to be a bad thing. At least he's being upfront about it and saying, if we're going to have a second referendum, we need to have someone who is going to enact what people decide, and people don't feel like, oh, did he actually have a different agenda on the cards?
OK, and we should say that we're focusing on Jeremy Corbyn. Obviously, other leaders were there as well, but because a few of the papers have put it as their main story,
that was the new thing.
It was a kind of news development, wasn't it? But there's a double-page spread in The Times, which focuses on what some of the other leaders said, and they all got a hard time, didn't they? The main headline there is, "Don't blame me for Tory era of austerity," Johnson tells hecklers, and he got a lot of questions on this issue of austerity, didn't he?
Yeah, I mean, I think, people are still feeling the effects of ongoing austerity. There's this line from the Conservatives that austerity is over. If you actually look at some of their plans, they would be putting in less money than they've taken out of parts of the system. And I think it's interesting that people are exercised and unhappy about this. We talk a lot about the economy and how the economy is run, and we're living in a country in which 4.1 million children are living in poverty. 1 in 50 households had to use food banks last year. That doesn't come out of nowhere. That is the result of policy. And what I think we saw tonight was people, certain members of the audience, incredibly angry about these kinds of things and trying to hold politicians like Boris Johnson to account, because he has voted for a lot of the policies that produced these austerity measures.
Do you think this is a vulnerable area for him?
I think most of the analysis shows that Boris Johnson didn't sort of go away with a massive win tonight, but he came out relatively unbruised. He sort of came out the same level that he came in, which for a serving Prime Minister can be counted as a success, really, if not a barnstorming victory. So what Boris has been saying as someone who was sort of outside the government, he wasn't an MP until 2015. He was, as Mayor of London, doing things slightly differently from the coalition government. He's got that sort of more credible argument that he can come in with less of the baggage that Theresa May had.
I mean, he was an MP voting for a lot of these cuts, and I think that's actually something that's also impacting Jo Swinson in this. So this idea that she wants to make this all about Brexit. I think their Brexit position actually is something that a lot of people can't get on board with in terms of revoke. It will appeal to some people, but also not to some Remainers. But for her, actually someone who voted for things like the bedroom tax, voted for things like cuts to benefits, she has very little to say, and she was really questioned about that, and she really couldn't respond because those policies have human effects, and I think that's what people feel very angry about. It's not just abstract discussion about cuts, it is the impact of those cuts on human beings.
And I noticed on social media and in the papers, everyone's got a different take on who had the hardest time, who dealt with it the best, so you probably might get the view you expect from different newspapers. Who knows? Anyway, let's move on to another story on the front page of The Express. This is about dementia and money being spent on trying to find a cure.
And I think the really interesting thing about this is less the content of the story and more the context of the story. And this is a policy announcement in the middle of a general election from the Conservative Party about healthcare, which is very unusual. If we look at the last few elections, the Conservative Party haven't been wanting to talk about the NHS. And yet this time round, we have a health secretary in Matt Hancock who is almost front and centre of that Conservative campaign, trying to take on that mantle of becoming the party of the NHS. And Matt Hancock in particular, inside The Express, has a profile on this where he talks very personally
4 and 5, isn't it? Yeah.
about his grandmother and her battle with dementia and sort of bringing that personal side into this campaign, talking in a much more compassionate way than perhaps you'd expect. He's really trying to bring forward the idea that the Conservative Party is fighting for the NHS.
Well, yes, and it's an area that Labour is traditionally seen to be their real strength. So do they feel challenged, do you think, by this?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right, the Conservatives are trying to make claims about the NHS and what they would do with the NHS, but I also think some of this doesn't quite work for them in terms of the general election. So if you look at things like A&E waiting times, they're at an all-time high, and that's happened under a Conservative government. But if you also look at things like the spending power of the NHS, it's risen on average about 4% every year since it was founded, and under the Coalition and the Conservatives, it rose just about 1.3% every year, and their current plans are about 3.4% rise. So what you'll see,
the largest cash boost.
So I think what is happening here is they are trying to reclaim ground on the NHS after making some of these decisions in government. And, you know, when people go to their hospitals and they go and try and use the health service, they really see that. They're really seeing the impact of that.
But Matt Hancock in particular is a very interesting politician on this. In his office in Westminster, he has a picture of Sir Henry Willink, who was the Conservative politician that laid down the first white paper for a national health service. So he's really trying to set out a vision for the Conservatives as that party that had a hand in creating this service as well.
OK, we must take a break. Plenty more, though, to come, including we're going to be discussing the calls to end the use of violent sex as a murder defence following the conviction of Grace Mullane's killer. More on that coming up.
Britain's Prince Charles and his wife Camilla have visited New Zealand's Christchurch, where they were greeted by students and attended a ceremony with Muslim community members. The Prince of Wales praised the people of Christchurch for their dignity and their responses to the March the 15th terror attacks before visiting Lincoln University, where he gave a State of the Environment speech and viewed student projects.
The worst of times, it seems to me, can so often bring out the very best in us all. In the wake of the terrible events of the 15th of March, we have seen many examples of this, as all the communities of Christchurch have stood proudly with their Muslim brothers and sisters.
A Philippine Airlines jet with flames coming from one engine has returned safely to Los Angeles International Airport shortly after takeoff. The Boeing 777 bound for Manila reported a problem with the right engine. It turned around and landed safely. A 1939 comic book that introduced Marvel characters for the first time has sold for a record $1.26 million at auction in the US. Marvel Comics #1 features the first appearances of characters including Human Torch and the Submariner. Decades later, Marvel debuted Spider-Man and the Incredible Hulk and other superheroes that have headlined recent blockbuster movies. And Tesla has unveiled its first ever pickup truck, a long-awaited expansion to its product line that poses a direct challenge to Detroit automakers. With a starting price of $39,900, the Cybertruck is less expensive than initially flagged. Production is expected to begin around late 2021.
Welcome back. You're watching the press preview. With me tonight, my good fellow and Tom Harwood. And we're going to take a look at the front page of The Guardian next, because they have put on their front page, the headline is "Calls to End Use of Violent Sex as a Murder Defence." And this is in the aftermath of the guilty verdict today in New Zealand of the murderer of Grace Millane, the backpacker, the British backpacker there.
Yeah, so what this is really saying is that senior lawyers and women's organisations have condemned this defence being used in courts, this idea of rough sex gone wrong. And what some of the research says that there's actually been a tenfold rise in the past 2 decades of this kind of claim being made in court. And it's interesting when you read throughout the story later on, is what's said is that consent is this kind of key concept in race cases, isn't a defence to injury or death. So we know that this isn't seen as a legitimate defence. So it's interesting that it's being used in this way. And what they're saying is we want to make it clear that we condemn this being done in court.
Yeah, it does seem extraordinary that there's been such a high rise in these sort of cases and this sort of excuse being sought as a way to get out. But I just hesitate at sort of wiping out an avenue and what sort of cases on the edge of these situations might be affected by that. I think it's an area that we need to look very, very carefully at and be very cautious about making knee-jerk responses to incredibly sad cases like this one.
And perhaps this case will start a debate about it.
Yeah, and I think it's less about closing it as an avenue, but also recognising the very pernicious ways that this is being used in defence and what that means for, often women's rights in these kinds of court cases.
OK, let's move on to the front page of the Daily Mirror next. They have put Prince Andrew on their front page again, and he must have been on the front page pretty much every day this week since his interview last Saturday night. This is inside the Daily Mail, but that photograph is also, I think we've got it on the front of the Mirror as well.
And the Eye. It's across
right.
the newspapers tonight, and it just shows, the incredible lack of judgment in this entire situation that has been dragging on for days and weeks almost now. I can't think of a scandal that has been so persistent and so poorly managed. The Newsnight interview decision in the first place seems to have been one of the most catastrophic PR ideas in the first place. But that to one side. This is an incredibly tragic case, and I think that when we're talking about the whole Weinstein issue and the dragging of the royal family into it,
Epstein,
all those,
the friendship with Epstein.
Yes, exactly. All of those issues being dragged in together, it just seems like it's an utter mess, and Prince Andrew has just really royally put his foot in it.
Yeah, and the photograph today that a lot of the papers have picked up on, there's this one of him out riding with the Queen. Some are interpreting that as a show of support. In fact, the Mirror, that's the first line of their copy.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, I think on the one hand, I think there's a risk of this becoming a bit of a media circus around the royal family, particularly when actually I think we should be focused on thinking about the victims, you know, the girls who were the victims of Epstein, and also thinking about why it was that Prince Andrew even ended up doing that interview. So his relationship and friendship with Epstein and what that means for him and what he may or may not be implicated in. But I think there is this other question about the image of the royal family, if you like, and it does seem like maybe this was some kind of show of support. But I think it's also interesting, you know, they're out riding, this kind of image of them as kind of these elites who have this power in society. I think there was the way that I read that interview, as well as wanting to center the victims, is thinking about, you know, a man who has a lot of power, privilege and wealth at his disposal, showing very, very little remorse or concern for the people who are affected by the actions of one of his friends.
And more companies today are pulling out of their associations with him, Barclays, Royal Philharmonic and National Ballet today. So we are out of time, but good to see you both. Thanks very much indeed for taking us through your papers.
Thank you.
Thanks.